Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This week, we're going to talk about some of the different indications that our government was well aware that the attacks were coming.
Hi, this is John, and I'm here with Ray McGovern. Ray, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, John. How are you?
I'm doing well. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read your bio for everyone. This is kind of lengthy, so bear with me. Ray McGovern leads the Speaking Truth to Power section of Tell the Word, an expression of the ecumenical Church of the Saviour in Inner City, Washington. A former co-director of the Servant Leadership School from 1998 to 2004, he has been teaching there for 15 years. Ray came from his native New York to Washington in the early 60s as an Army infantry intelligence officer, and then served as a CIA analyst from the administration of John F. Kennedy to that of George H.W. Bush. Ray's duties included chairing national intelligence estimates and preparing the president's daily brief, which he briefed one-on-one to President Ronald Reagan's most senior national security advisors from 1981 to 1985. In January 2003, Ray helped create Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or VIPS, to expose the way intelligence was being falsified to, quote, justify, end quote, war on Iraq. On the afternoon of the day, February 5th, 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell misled the UN Security Council on Iraq. VIPS sent a blunt memorandum to President George W. Bush in which VIPS gave Powell a C- for content. They ended the memo with this, quote, "No one has a corner on the truth, nor do we harbor illusions that our analysis is irrefutable or undeniable, as Powell had claimed. But after watching Secretary Powell today, we are convinced that you would be well served if you widened the discussion beyond the circle of those advisors clearly bent on a war for which we see no compelling reason and from which we believe the unintended consequences are likely to be catastrophic," end quote. Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Jay Rockefeller, after a 5-year study by his committee, described the intelligence used to, quote, justify, end quote, war on Iraq as, quote, unsubstantiated, contradicted, or even non-existent, end quote. In other words, it was not mistaken, it was fraudulent. As an act of conscience, on March 2nd, 2006, Ray returned the Intelligence Commendation Medallion given him at retirement for, quote, especially meritorious service, end quote, explaining, quote, "I do not want to be associated, however remotely, with an agency engaged in torture," end quote. He returned it to Representative Peter Hofstra, Republican from Michigan, then chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Hofstra added to the Intelligence Authorization Act of FY07 HR 5020 a provision enabling the government to strip intelligence veterans of their government pensions. HR 5020 passed the full House, but Congress opted instead for a continuing resolution. Thus, Ray was spared from having to go back to driving part-time for Red Top Cab. On the early afternoon of May 4th, 2006, in Atlanta, Ray confronted Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld on live TV with pointed questions like, quote, "Why did you lie to get us into a war that was not necessary and that has caused these kinds of casualties," end quote. Wow, I've never read that before. It was an honor to quote you on that. The impromptu 4-minute mini debate that followed is still receiving hits on YouTube. Accused by TV pundits that evening of, quote, following the Secretary of Defense all the way down to Atlanta, end quote, Ray explained that he had gotten to Atlanta first to receive that same evening the ACLU's National Civil Liberties Award, won the previous year by Coretta Scott King. Ray's opinion pieces have appeared in many leading newspapers here and abroad. His website writings are usually posted first on consortiumnews.com, as well as here on raymcgovern.com, and they are usually then cross-posted widely on other websites. Ray still serves on the steering group of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or VIPS. 26 corporate issuances are posted on warisacrime.org/VIPS. He has debated twice at the Oxford Forum, most recently in January 2013, when he chose to take a lighter tone in trying to explain why it is still possible to dream the American dream. Ray has appeared on the NewsHour, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, CNN, Al Jazeera, RT, Press TV, and numerous other TV and radio programs and documentaries. His favorite gig was debating former CIA Director Woolsey on Charlie Rose on August 20th, 2004, which, by the way, is available at my YouTube channel, Gold9472. Ray has also addressed a wide variety of audiences in the U.S. and abroad. He studied theology and philosophy, as well as his major, Russian, at Fordham University, from which he holds 2 degrees. He also holds a certificate in theological studies from Georgetown University and is a graduate of Harvard Business School's Advanced Management Program. A Catholic, Ray has been worshiping for over a decade with the Ecumenical Church of the Saviour. He has been invited to lecture at various interfaith and ecumenical events around the U.S. and has preached at a number of Christian churches and Jewish synagogues. Ray is particularly fond of the, quote, substitute teaching, end quote, he has been invited to do at universities and colleges. At Georgetown University, though, he quickly wore out his welcome when he stood silently with his back turned toward then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He was seized and badly beaten while Secretary Clinton spoke eloquently about the need for freedom of expression in Iran. So that's Ray's bio. I remember all of that stuff and cheering you on and, hoping you were okay when you were beaten up and all of that stuff. I have a little personal story to tell about Ray. On September 11th, 2004, in Washington, D.C., Pacifica Radio held what was called the 9/11 People's Conference, or 9/11 People's Commission. And at that commission, I was fortunate enough to get the first question, and I directed it towards Ray. And my question had to do with the CIA's involvement in the drug trade. I talked a little bit about peak oil, or the idea of peak oil. And then I finally asked Ray, what would the motivations be for the administration, the Bush administration, to, quote, allow, end quote, the attacks to happen? And what Ray said to me stayed with me for years, and it was a clever acronym, a clever formula that seemed to be right, dead on. And what he said to me was he had an acronym for oil. O for oil, I for the protection of Israel, and L for the logistical placement of bases in that region for future use. And, Ray has been extremely influential to me over the years. He's a hero of mine, and it's an honor to have him on the show today. So, are you ready to get started?
All set.
All right, excellent. The first question is, what was the day of 9/11 like for you?
Well, I was in my office working away there, and across the hall there was a woman with the radio on very loud, and about 9 o'clock I went into her and I said, I'm trying to concentrate. Would you turn that thing down? That's the way I learned what was going on. So what I did is what I normally do when something horrible is happening and I can't do anything about it at the time. I went back and finished my work and went home after all the other people in Washington had evacuated, and got home in good shape, and then started to think about the implications as to what had just happened. So, in a shorthand, that's what I remember of 9/11.
Now, what was the first thing that you questioned about the 9/11 attacks?
Well, I was wondering.
Besides what would happen from that point?
Well, as the days went on, it was very clear that President Bush, given the opportunity to choose between two courses of action, one in the best traditions of our country, and the other appealing to the worst instincts of all humans, he chose revenge. His dad, a week later, said that his son George had read the Bible through completely twice. That's what George H.W. Bush said. Well, I don't know. I think he missed a lot of it, actually. Maybe sped read through, or maybe he was doing something else while he was supposed to be reading the Bible. But, it doesn't say vengeance is mine, says Bush and Cheney. It says vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Bush and Cheney decided to use this in the most, the adjectives and adverbs are coming to my mind, but they're not good for taping on radio. In the most unsavory way did George Bush and Dick Cheney lead the country to believe that this was a hostile attack from an entity upon which we needed to make war. This is the first time in history that I had heard of a war against a concept, namely terrorism, and not a country or movement or something like that. So, long story short, I began to fear that the worst would happen, and indeed, I didn't know the half of it.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about the concept of terrorism, having a war against that. When the FBI sets up people through entrapment to create terrorists and then stop their own plots, or when the United States collaborates with Al-Qaeda-linked groups in countries like Libya and wherever else, I often ask myself, how can we have a war on terror if we're supporting terrorists here or creating terrorists there? So that's interesting.
John, you have to realize that they're good terrorists and they're bad terrorists. We're only against the bad terrorists. So when I was asked, it's a little aside, but it's very relevant. The head of the operations department of the CIA was invited to give a major lecture at my alma mater, Fordham. And he came in and he said, "Hi, Ray, I'm going to mention you together with Bill Casey and John Brennan, who are both alumni, And I said, please, thank you very much, but don't mention me in the same sentence as those two guys, Mike." And his name was Mike Sulik, and he's a nice guy, but in charge of all the terrorism and the good guy terrorism, the torture, the kidnapping, the black sites. So he's up there, and make a long story short, he's being lionized by everybody, including the Republican club that invited him. And then a innocent question came from a graduate student, and it seemed innocent at the time, so the people who were vetting the questions let it through, and they said, "Well, here's a question for a graduate student. Dr. Sulik, how do you define terrorism?" And I'll tell you, I was sitting in the fourth row. The proverbial deer who's caught in the headlights?
Yeah.
It was quite embarrassing. And he said, Ray McGovern's here, and he worked in analysis, so maybe maybe he could answer that question.
Nice.
I said, thank you, Jesus. Thank you. I walked up to the podium and I said, well, you have to understand there are good terrorists, there are bad terrorists. The good ones are the ones that are doing terrorism in places like Nicaragua or wherever we want to overthrow governments or push drugs or whatever. Those are the good ones. The bad ones are the ones that take exception to your invading their country, setting up regimes that oppress them. Those are the bad terrorists. So just kind of realize that it's not really simple. The good terrorists and the bad terrorists. So I ended up with my question. I said, well, Mike, his name was Mike Sulik. Mike, how do you justify, how do you square the concept of the sanctity of life, which we Catholics are really good at for like the first 9 months, but then, kind of don't pay much attention to young boys, and then when they become old boys, we send them off to war. How do you justify the sanctity of life with killing a whole bunch of people who don't look like us? The head of the student council said, "Oh, Dr. Sulik, you don't have to answer that. You don't have to answer that." And he said, "Come on, he's a big boy. He should know the answer to that." But Dr. Sulik hid in the shadows until the next softball question was given. So all I'm saying here is that, state-sponsored terror, think drones have killed thousands of people, including, of course, innocent people, in a sort of, quote, clean, end quote, way, where then you don't have to imprison them, then you have to take them to Guantanamo. Think all those kinds of things, torture, imprisonment in black prisons, and the whole schmear, kidnapping, that's terrorism done by us. So it's good terrorism. We don't call it terrorism. The only terrorism happens when we kill civilians in Afghanistan, let's say, and their extended family, all 30 of them, show up at the next Al-Qaeda recruiting station, pledged to do jihad to get vengeance on those who killed their relatives. So it's, it's almost, it's not funny. It's not funny at all.
No, it's not.
But that's the real explanation of terrorism, the war on terrorism.
Do you remember the many statements made by officials in the days, months, and years after 9/11 indicating that there were no warnings or indications that an attack like 9/11 was coming?
Well, those are lies. There were many warnings. The president himself was warned on the 6th of August that Al-Qaeda was determined to strike within the U.S. Condoleezza Rice lied about that. George W. Bush was said to have dismissed the PDB, that's the President's Daily Briefer, that morning by saying, yeah, all right, now you covered your ass, right, okay. And then he went off fishing, I think, or he went off to see some baseball game or something. August 6th, 2001, so what's that? That's about 5 weeks before 9/11. There was that, and there were things that went on during that August period that have been veiled or have been kept from the American people. During the 9/11 Commission proceedings, when George Tenet, the head of the CIA, was put on sworn under oath in his testimony, his sworn testimony, who was it? The congressman from Indiana. He says, now, Director Tenet, how many times did you speak with the president during August? And I said, I didn't speak to him at all. And the member of the 9/11 Commission, previous congressperson, said, well,
Timothy Romer. That's his name.
What's that?
Timothy Romer, I believe you're talking about.
Yeah, it was Tim Romer, yeah. He says, well, now, are you telling me that you didn't, not even by telephone, you didn't talk to the president at all during the month of August? And Tenet said, no, sir, no, not at all. I mean, he was on vacation there in Crawford, and I, I took a little bit of annual leave too. So it was August. Well, guess what? Tenet was lying to his teeth. He flew down to see the president in Crawford, not once, as most people kind of know, but twice during August. And then he briefed them in Washington again on the last day of August, the 31st. Now, after the TV cameras went home and 9/11 Commission shut down for the day, Bill Harlow, who happens to be Tenet's sort of propagandist, he called the commission staff and he said, sorry, my boss, Tenet, misspoke. And even then, Harlow only admitted to that first visit to Crawford, which ironically, Tenet writes up in his memoirs, being, it was just fantastic. The president was so cordial. He drove me around in his Jeep, and there were flotsam and jetsam there that I've never seen in Queens, and it was just great. So that was August 17th. Now, guess what? He went back again on August 24th. Now, how did he explain August 17th? Well, he said, I wanted to follow up on that warning that we'd given the president on the 6th in the president's daily brief about al-Qaeda determined to strike in the U.S. I just wanted to make sure he knew that. Well, why did he go on the 24th? Why does nobody else know that he went on the 24th? How did I find out he went on the 24th? Well, as usual, I scour the media and the blogs, and it wasn't that I came upon this myself, but someone else pointed out that there was a White House press release quoting President Bush to the effect that Tenet had been there on the 24th as well. Now, it's really funny that under sworn testimony before the 9/11 Commission, that Tenet could have forgotten that first visit, which he bragged about so much in his memoir, but then the second. Well, how do you explain the second? Well, the second came right after they found out that Moussaoui, now he was the terrorist, he was the hijacker, presumed hijacker that was training to fly big Boeings and not terribly concerned about learning to take off or to land, actually just to steer them. Was it suspicious? Yeah, it was so suspicious that the people at the training center very discreetly told the FBI office there in Minneapolis, and finally they wrapped up Moussaoui on charges unrelated because they're the only charges they had. Okay, now, why do I mention that? Well, because on the 23rd of August, so one day before Tenet hustled back down to Crawford, Tenet was given an alarming briefing focusing on Moussaoui, who had been in court, okay? And the title of the briefing was, quote, Islamic extremists learn to fly, end quote. Tenet was told that Moussaoui was trained to fly a 747 and had paid for the training in cash. Now, what did he do? Well, now he checked out to see if Moussaoui was connected with any terrorist groups, and the word came in. Yep, he had ties with those groups there in Chechnya. He was a terrorist, pure and simple. Now, what happened? Well, Tenet went down and told Bush about this. Presumably, I don't have any proof that he did, but here he goes to stay there on a secret flight, right? So what happened?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, what was that?
I was going to say that according to, I think, official sources or whatever, he did not tell Bush about Moussaoui, but we don't know that.
Well, yeah, I guess that's why I said that I don't have any specific information as to why he told or why he went down to Crawford. But what we know, and this is good enough for an intelligence analyst, and once one, always one, I suppose. What we know is that he'd been there on the 17th. He was following up on that PDB briefing, And why would he go back a week later on a secret mission? Never mentioned. Why would he go back the day after he learned that Moussaoui was tied to terrorism? So I think it's a good inference that he went when he heard the information that Moussaoui was tied to terrorism, and this was important because then they could have wrapped him up. But the FBI decided not to wrap him up. And so Moussaoui's laptop, Moussaoui's effects were not permitted to be investigated before 9/11. We're talking, just 2 weeks, 3 weeks before 9/11. So there's that. And then there's the whole business about those two hijackers out there in San Diego. Al-Hazmi and Al-Mindar. Now, you got into that a little bit with Senator Graham, and I have lots to say about Senator Graham and his behavior during this whole thing. But let's just suffice it to say that Al-Hazmi and Al-Mindar were being prepared to fly Flight 77 into the Pentagon. Now, the President of the United States, this time Barack Obama, got up a year ago, and in defending the dragnet-type surveillance, the blanket surveillance of all of us, all our telephone calls and stuff, he intimated that if we had this broad coverage of all our telephone calls and all, then maybe we would have been able to find out the telephone number in San Diego, which had called the Al-Qaeda Central in Yemen, and we might have been able to track down the terrorists. Okay, well, guess what? That's a lie. That's a lie. If you talk to the NSA people, as I have, Bill Binney, for example, senior scientist there for 35 years, he says, Ray, if they only had the number, Ray, do you know about caller ID? I said, yeah, I know. That's as simple as it is. Ray, they had the number. They had the number, and when Bush talks about, well, same difference really. When Obama talks about that one telephone call between San Diego and the Al-Qaeda safe house there, the switchboard, he's lying. There were at least 6 calls. We know that because the chief of the Counterterrorism Center has said that. And guess what, Ray? We didn't only have the metadata. We had the content. So why did NSA not report that? That remains a big mystery, but we ought to get General Michael Hayden, who's such a favorite on Fox News, we ought to get him on the stand and say, why is it that you didn't report those things? Why is it that you had information galore? And NSA people tell me they had not only pinpointed all the Al-Qaeda networks and so forth, but they had this information before 9/11 and did not report it.
Well, one of the guests that I've had on was NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake, and he confirmed to me that the NSA did have the identities of the phone number from the San Diego hijackers, which means they knew they were in America and did not tell the FBI. And the 9/11 Commission barely investigated the NSA. And so we have no idea what was in those calls. We have no idea, basically, what information the NSA had specifically. I know that Thomas Drake testified before the Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11, but apparently the transcripts or whatever were destroyed. The only thing that's remaining is the fact that he testified. But he was the one who brought in the quote-unquote smoking guns to the inquiry to let them know, and all of those records have been destroyed apparently.
Yeah, now what does that say about your distinguished guest, Senator Graham? What does that say about his groveling attitude toward the executive branch? What does that say about his acquiescence in this fraud, in this cover-up, and his continuing cowardice in not releasing what was in those 28 pages. What does it say about the fact that he chose to write a novel? Isn't that neat? He write a novel which parallels what really happened. Give me a break. Graham is just as responsible for our not knowing about what went down on 9/11 as anybody. And for him to be kind of sidestepping all your questions and saying, well, it was really hard. Cheney didn't want this to succeed. Graham should have quit on the spot. Instead, what Graham did was really, it was really reprehensible. Here, let me show you. Let me read from something I wrote at the time. I was out in San Diego by some coincidence, and I was listening to the end of the Joint Congressional Committee, which investigated 9/11. The final report. This was interesting. The chair of that committee was clearly frustrated as hell. Her name was Eleanor Hill, okay? She was a pretty good person. And she began the session by saying, now, I want everyone to realize that we talked into the night with the White House and with the CIA, and we were unable to include in this report any information having to do with what the President of the United States was told prior to 9/11. The White House forbade that from being in the final report. So the report was ipso facto incomplete because it contains lots of stuff but nothing on what the President was told before 9/11. Now that's proof positive to me that you've got a partisan person here who will do the bidding of the White House. And that's precisely why Porter Goss, the co-chair of this committee, was eventually nominated to become the director of Central Intelligence, the head of the CIA. So what I'm saying here is that what Graham presided over was a fraud on the American people, and he dished it off to the congressional, but not the congressional, but the 9/11 Commission, which was fraud number 2, witnessed the fact that the co-chairs of that commission, former Governor Kane from New Jersey and Lee Hamilton, the token Democrat who was trotted out for such investigations, wrote a book 4 years after the 9/11 Commission report in which they said, and I quote, "We were set up to fail. We were not given enough information, not given enough time. We were not given enough access to sensitive information. We weren't given enough money, and so we were set up to fail." Now, isn't that nice? Isn't that just dandy?
Do you know what people say, debunkers or whatever, say to that argument? They say that they never actually admitted that they failed. They just said that they were set up to fail.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, you get the idea. What I'm saying is that the Congress, rather than acting like a co-equal, actually the first among equal branches of our government representing the people as they do, are acting in such a slavish, subservient, deferential way to the executive, deathly afraid that the president might accuse them of being soft on, quote, terrorism. I mean, the bad terrorism we're talking about now, bad terrorism, okay? Or that they would be, that they would be degraded or criticized in other ways. You have Dick Durbin, for example. Now, he's not the worst of the senators, but, he tells this story about, he knew before 9/11. He knew something was going down. Yeah, well, he had been briefed. That's why he could never, actually, it wasn't 9/11 I'm talking about now. It's the weapons of mass destruction, okay? So strike that. Dick Durbin said, I was briefed. I asked George Tenet and all those guys. I could tell it, I said, but, when you go into that room and they tell you it's all secret, then when you come out of the room, you can't tell anybody. And so I voted against the war, but I couldn't tell anybody. Well, it was there was a crock. And the same with Bob Graham, for God's sake. He was chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he voted against the war, but he didn't tell any other senators. Why? Because they got a secret. Give me a break. That's not acting as a co-equal branch of government. And if I sound a little angry, well, you can pardon me, because I'm Irish, and also because I think there's just cause for anger here, and people like Bob Graham should not be treated with kid gloves.
Well, I tried not to. I tried to play nice because, honey versus vinegar and all of that stuff. And you're right. You're absolutely right. But I try to cut him some slack only because he's trying to help the families do something that they really wanted, which is get those 28 redacted pages released so as to use in a courtroom. So I agree with everything you said. I cut him some slack only because helping the family.
This is not by any means a criticism of the way you interviewed him. You had to do it that way. All I'm saying is that maybe he's trying to do penance or something for his misfeasance, I guess, rather than malfeasance in those days. His gutless performance, let's say. He and Portergoss knew better. When you asked him about Cheney, Cheney didn't like what we were doing. Cheney threatened not to allow any administration officials to testify before they joined the committee. That's what Cheney did. Cheney sent the FBI in to investigate and subject senators and representatives to lie detector tests because of that leak that you mentioned about Graham. That was Cheney, and they all shuddered in their boots. Oh, okay. That investigation did not get off the ground for 3 months because there was a big brouhaha about who the executive director was. Finally, they found somebody, and the whole thing lasted about 2 more months, and Eleanor Hill, tried as she may, she couldn't get to first base. How many public hearings were there? 1, the last one, where Eleanor Hill, to her credit, got up and said, look, what you going to get here? You should be aware of no information, not even publicly available information that's in the Washington Post, New York Times. Nothing is allowed to be said in this report to indicate what the president was told or not told before 9/11. Well, if I were Bob Graham, I would be very ashamed to sign off on a report like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'd just like to mention that the Jersey girls love Eleanor Hill, and they wanted her to be a part of the 9/11 Commission, but that never happened. With regards to the August 6th presidential daily briefing, I have a couple of things to say. First off, there was a report by Kurt Eichenwald in the New York Times on September 10th, 2012, and he says he apparently gained access to some of the presidential daily briefings that came prior to the August 6th PDB. He didn't gain access to all of them. He read a couple of excerpts, and they're not made public for anybody. But he said, quote, "The August 6th document, for all of the controversy it provoked, is not nearly as shocking as the briefs that came before it," end quote. And, let's talk about what was in the August 6th PDB really quick. It said FBI information since that time indicates patterns of suspicious activity in this country consistent with preparations for hijackings or other types of attacks, including recent surveillance of federal buildings in New York, end quote. So if it was even worse than that, we don't know, because unfortunately, Bush was briefed 40 times on al-Qaeda related issues. He had 40 presidential daily briefs, and we have no idea what they said. And unfortunately, during the 9/11 Commission, only 4 people were allowed access to certain PDBs, and that was Thomas Keane, Lee Hamilton, Philip Zelikow, and Jamie Gorelick. And at the time, the family members, I have a quote from them, a statement that they released at the time. And they said, quote, all 10 commissioners should have full, unfettered, and unrestricted access to all evidence, including but not limited to all presidential daily briefings and all working notes related to those presidential daily briefings that may be related to the attacks on 9/11. As it now stands, a limited number of commissioners will have restricted access to a limited number of PDB documents. This will prevent a full uncovering of the truth and is unacceptable, end quote. And that was from a statement that they released on November 13th, 2003. Now, when it was announced that Zelikow was going to be a part of the people to read these presidential daily briefs, Kristen Brautweiser said, quote, how much more of Zelikow do we have to take, end quote. So as to what they knew, to me, they had two options after 9/11. They could have denied everything, denied any knowledge whatsoever, or they could have taken responsibility and said, yes, we had some indications and some, warnings that came in, but we screwed up. And as we saw, from the Richard Clark testimony, when he apologized to the families, how much they loved that, it seems like that would have been a better PR route. But because of the fact that they denied any knowledge whatsoever and acted like this was a surprise attack, tells me that they knew a hell of a lot more than has been led on.
Well, they certainly did. Now, whether they took it seriously or not, despite the credible reports that George Tenet, the head of the CIA, and his chief lieutenants had their hair on fire in briefing Condoleezza Rice and Bush. You see, when you have people who are really toadies, people who, like George Tenet, came up through the congressional staffer ranks where, you really try to make everybody happy and you don't say anything that will not knock any noses out of joint. That's the exact wrong kinds of people to have in that situation. So let's say George Tenet and his lieutenants, the anti-terrorist people, who have 87 indications that Al-Qaeda is going to attack us in the United States, they go to Condoleezza Rice and they say, hey, this is really bad. Our hair is on fire. We got to get this stopped. And Condoleezza Rice, in her great wisdom, says, the president's not interested in this. How many times do I have to tell you? Ashcroft has cut the budget for counterterrorism. This is Bill Clinton. This is, the previous regimes here, for Pete's sake. I know you left that big folder on my desk when I came in, but I'm not ready yet. And I'll tell you what, I'll try to arrange, let me see if I can arrange a meeting, let's say, let's try September 4th. So maybe September 4th. Can you come back then and we'll talk about that? Well, that's exactly what happened, okay? So, sure, Tenet and those guys knew more, but the way Tenet explains it, now bear in mind, Tenet is a guy that hitched a ride down with the PDB briefer in the morning to get FaceTime with George W. Bush so that George W. Bush would keep him on, okay? So he's seeing him 5 mornings a week. And what Tenet said when he was asked, well, why did you stop with Condoleezza Rice? Why didn't you just tell the president? He already said, that's not my place. And 16 intelligence agencies at the time, and it's not his place? Well, I think he told the president, and the president said, look, George, I told you, I don't want to, you cover your ass enough times, I don't want to hear it. So there was a lot of, hubris, there's a lot of arrogance. We know better. These guys, you can't take them seriously. And that has a very, very, kind of throws a wet blanket on people like George Tenet, people like Michael Hayden over there at NSA, people like Bob Nerlin at FBI. They put the word out. Look, the president isn't very interested in this. We find it really interesting, but And so what happens? Well, they have the telephone number of these guys in San Diego. They also know that they're there, and the CIA knows that they're there for a couple of years before they tell the FBI. When did they tell the FBI? On September 4th, 2011, at that meeting, at 2001, at that meeting, 1 week before 9/11. Why did they hide that information? Well, Richard Clark has spoken to that on a very obscure radio station out there in Denver, Colorado. Got no treatment, got no publicity in the mainstream media. But what he said was that there were 50 people at CIA who knew about Hazmi and Mindar out there in San Diego and never told the FBI about them, okay, until September the 4th, okay? Now, Clark is asked by these two young, very, very good reporters, well, what do you suppose that was? And Clark says, well, it can't be a glitch because, all that stuff came to me. All the, I come in early in the morning and first hour or so I read through all it. George Tenet shared everything with me except this. And they said, well, why would he not give you that? And Clark said, I've been thinking about that for 3 years now. And the only explanation, seems to me, is this, that the CIA was embarrassingly short of sources in Al-Qaeda or even close to Al-Qaeda. When I say short, they had zero, okay? Whoops, here's two live bodies, Mindar and Hazmi. Whoa, man, if we can turn them, then they become our agents. And we go to the president and say, hey, now we got two live ones that are working for us. Now we're going to find out all kinds of things about Al-Qaeda. Now, Clark says that's the only thing that makes any sense. Why does this work out this way? Because once the CIA told the FBI about these two guys in San Diego, guess what? The CIA loses control over those people and over any operations. In other words, once you tell the FBI, and these guys are in the United States of America, it's the FBI's action, and CIA doesn't have the ability to turn these guys, sort of a term of the trade means to recruit them to be double agents or whatever. That's the only explanation that Clark could come up with, and it's the only one that makes any sense to me. These people are not above that. So why was it that the two hijackers from San Diego were able to crash into the Pentagon? Well, we know now, but not many Americans know, and that's the problem.
I have a couple of questions about that because, obviously the CIA is not allowed to operate on American soil. Those two hijackers in San Diego apparently had connections to the Saudi government as well. And George Tenet had a great relationship with Prince Bandar. Were they monitoring these people? Did they have wiretaps on these people while they were in the United States? Because I would think that if you're going to flip somebody, you would want to know everything there is to know about them so as to be able to use that information. So I'm wondering, did they ever wiretap a conversation about 9/11 or something to that effect? I don't know. That's all speculative.
If they didn't, it would have been because of the political problem here. Now, they're in San Diego. That's part of the United States, okay? The FBI is supposed to have the action, and the FBI is sort of onto it because one of the guys working for them is the landlord of these two guys. Graham mentioned that. And not only that, but you have Prince Bandar, the ambassador from Saudi Arabia to Washington. His wife is paying these guys. Now, when was that known? I'm not sure. But if the CIA wanted to monitor their conversations or to really do intrusive surveillance on them, they had not only the Saudis, not only the hijackers themselves, but the FBI itself to contend with. In other words, they had to be really discreet here, or else the FBI might realize that these guys, who they were and how they got into the country and all that business. So it's an insidious, it's a what's the word, it's a despicable example of bureaucratic rivalries, and they exist between the FBI and the CIA from the very foundation, the very creation of the CIA, and they are still not healed, except to cover up one for the other.
Now, with regards to the Richard Clarke interview, the individuals that did that were Ray Novoselsky and John Duffy, also the makers of the film 9/11 Press for Truth. One of the things that Ray Novoselsky said that was interesting is that you mentioned there were 50 people that were aware of this information. And it just so happens that Alex Station, the bin Laden unit, was pretty much made up of 50 people. And one of the instances that really just seems so criminal to me is that there were two FBI agents assigned to Alex Station, Doug Miller and Mark Rossini. And I believe that Doug Miller, it might have been one or the other, but I'd say Doug Miller found out that one of the hijackers had a visa to the United States. So he goes to somebody by the name of Michael Ann Casey to ask if he can send a draft to the FBI to notify them of this. And under orders from Tom Wilshire, Michael Ann Casey tells him, no, you can't do that. And hours later in the day, Michael Ann Casey sends out a cable within the CIA overseas saying that the FBI was notified. And that just seems so criminal to me. We talk about accountability and the lack of accountability. Tom Wilshire, Michael Ann Casey, these are people that need to be held accountable as far as I'm concerned.
Well, the same people that were moved up under George Tenet and John McLaughlin, the same operations part that did the torture, the kidnapping, the black prisons, So one shouldn't be surprised. Once you corrupt the whole operational arm of an agency, these are the kinds of people that move up and do whatever you tell them to do, including lie to the field. Now, why did they lie to the field? Because, you take the CIA station in London, well, they work side by side with the FBI representatives there. And so if the FBI is going to ask the CIA, have you shared this? And of course they sure, yeah, here's a cable showing we shared this, but they didn't. Now, you mentioned Rossini. To his credit, he has a very tearful confession about what went down, how he didn't have the guts to violate orders to withhold information about the two hijackers in San Diego, and he just feels terrible about putting the orders, just following orders, as we know how that happens, ahead of his patriotic duty to tell the truth, because had those people been wrapped up, or even had the FBI allowed Moussawi's computer to be searched, or even if the FBI had allowed the capture of Moussawi to be publicized, the whole thing might have been aborted, because once you get one guy who's compromised, you have no assurance that the operation can go forward. So there are a whole bunch of things that weren't done that could have nipped the thing in the bud, and that raises legitimate questions as to why they weren't done, whether it was, and what we know now, whether it's the result of covering up misfeasance, malfeasance, crimes, or whether it's covering up actual knowledge and involvement of exactly what was going down. That, in my view, is something that really needs to be sorted out, but that has to begin with an acknowledgement that we were sold a bill of goods by the 9/11 Commission, that Kane and Hamilton should be put in jail for presiding over this charade, and that's an independent investigation needs to be laid into operation, and that's going to be up to us and the families. And I don't know how we do this, but tougher things have been undertaken and tougher things have been done, and that's exactly what we owe to the families, what we owe to the country, given all the incredible effects of this. After 9/11, everything changed.
Well, we owe it to the world. And with regards to the 9/11 Commission and what you just said about Tom Keene and Lee Hamilton and so forth, Bob McElveen, 9/11 family member Bob McElveen, is going to love what you just said. Now, with regards to the 9/11 Commission, I have a little quote here, and this is from a 9/11 family member, Jersey girl, September 11th advocate, Patty Casaza. In late November 2007, we had a conference in New Hartford, Connecticut, and she showed up as a surprise. And I was thrilled. I'd never met a Jersey girl, and she walked in, and I said, "Patty," and I ran up to her, and I gave her a hug, and then I asked her to take a couple of questions on the stage. And one of the things that she told us was, quote, "We met other whistleblowers on the side of the road in Maryland, to hear what they could tell us. None of them revealed state secrets to us, by the way, haha. But they had information, and basically the government knew. Other than the exact moment, they knew the date and the method of which the attacks were supposed to come." And then she goes on, "Other than the exact, perhaps, time, because planes don't always go off on time. They knew the date, they knew the method, that it was going to be with airplanes," end quote. And unfortunately, the 9/11 Commission didn't speak or barely spoke to any whistleblowers, even though there was a lineup of available whistleblowers, and they promised the families that each and every one of them would be heard. Now, wouldn't you like to have heard from a whistleblower who knew that kind of information? I certainly would have.
First, let me amend what I said about Kane and Hamilton. I perhaps did them a disservice. They should be in prison, but Silly Cow should be right there with them. These people.
My goodness, yes.
Yeah. Now, the business of, I don't know how much Tom Drake told you, but we did a long memorandum, VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity.
Yep.
Laid it on, and the four senior scientists from NSA pretty much drafted it, and we put it together. It's dated 7 January of last year, 2014. And this is the first time that Tom is very frank about what he learned. What he learned, of course, was that the information was available, and that it was not shared outside of NSA, but that chances are the leadership, including General Hayden, knew about it. And, General Hayden used to have these staff meetings, and Tom Drake hung around for a while after 9/11. Actually, 9/11 was his first day on the job. The others quit because they couldn't countenance the violations of the Fourth Amendment. So Tom was in on all this, and he used to listen to Mike Hayden cackle.
Yep.
The Joint Commission? It's kind of fun to see the FBI and CIA taking all the criticism here, and we're just sitting up with our feet up. And Hayden knew, and Tom knew, and most of the people at the very top, not all of them, but most of the people at the very top of NSA knew darn well that NSA had been able to stiff-arm both commissions, okay? Stiff-arm them, not give them the information. Who helped them on that? Of course, Dick Cheney and others. So it's conceivable to me that Dick Cheney, and there are ways for NSA to report just to one person or two, and it's conceivable to me that Dick Cheney was fully apprised of that. His behavior in the bunker raises all manner of questions, and so it just cries out for thorough, dispassionate, objective analysis and investigation, and it's a blunder. It's a kind of a cancer on the body politic that this has not been done. And I'm from New York. My wife's cousin was killed in one of those buildings. I'm not the New Yorkers for what they've tried to do, but they need some help from everyone in these United States of America.
Now, with regards to what you just said about Dick Cheney, there is a report that Scooter Libby was reading unvetted NSA intercepts, and it's unclear, however, whether that was taking place prior to 9/11 or after 9/11, and I've been trying to find out, and I can't. Now, one of the questions that I have, are you aware of the multitude of warnings we received from foreign countries before 9/11?
Sure, yeah. The Russians, Israelis, the Germans, there were a whole bunch of people that warned. They had their own sources, of course, and somehow or other they were not taken very seriously.
Well, I have a couple of them that I'd just like to read for people, just so they have an understanding of what kind of information was coming in. In 1999, MI6, the British intelligence agency, gives a secret report to liaison staff at the U.S. Embassy in London. The report states that Al-Qaeda has plans to use, quote, commercial aircraft in unconventional ways, possibly as flying bombs. That's according to the Sunday Times, June 9th, 2002. In June 2001, German intelligence warns the CIA, Britain's intelligence agency, and Israel's Mossad that Middle Eastern militants are planning to hijack commercial aircraft to use as weapons to attack, quote, American and Israeli symbols which stand out, end quote. And that's according to Frankfurt and the Washington Post. On June 4th, 2001, 3 men claiming to be Afghans are overheard discussing hijacking attacks in New York City during this period. On this day, they are taken into custody, questioned, and released from sometime later. This information is forwarded to U.S. intelligence. And that's according to Fox News, May 17th, 2002. And I think it was passed along by Cayman and British investigators. And this is one that you just mentioned. In August 2001, our enemies right now, the people that the powers that be declare to be our enemies, apparently Vladimir Putin or his intelligence people warns the U.S. that suicide pilots are training for attacks on U.S. targets. The head of Russian intelligence, Nikolai Patrushev, also states, quote, we had clearly warned them, end quote, on several occasions, but they, quote, did not pay the necessary attention, end quote. And that's according to Fox News, 5/17/2002, and Agence France-Presse, 9/16/2001. Now, one question that I've always had. Now, everybody says that, and this is all speculative, but it's a question that I have. Everybody always says that they did nothing, that they had all this information, that they did nothing. My question is, if you had all of this information, isn't it conceivable that people in the upper echelons of power could have taken that information and used it and done things that would have caused the success of the quote-unquote success of the attacks? Is that a valid question?
I'm sure it's a valid question, and so raises another question about who prevented that from being done. Who gave the word from on high that this should not be taken seriously? Or, yeah, thanks very much. You've covered your ass, as George Bush is quoted as having said, and just go about your business. We're not interested in this kind of thing. Now, whether that was from rank amateurishness and not taking these things seriously, or there was something more sinister, that's what we need to probe. You know, there's one other thing here that most people don't know. But Colleen Rowley, our colleague and veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity, who was the division counsel and special agent out there at the Minneapolis office of the FBI, she and the head of the red team for the FAA, a fellow named Bogdan Zakovich, wrote a piece in the LA Times way back about 4 years ago. And the reason they wrote it is that the question was, WikiLeaks was able to reveal all manner of interesting things if, for example, the agents in Minneapolis, in the FBI office there, if they got nowhere important with their reporting on Moussaoui, would they have gone to Julian Assange and been able to get their reports published that way? That was one thing. The other thing was this FAA special agent. Okay, now, he was head of the red team, and their job was to penetrate airports and aircraft, or airplanes, right, to see if they could. And 9 times out of 10, they could. And so he was incredibly agitated and frustrated because he could not get anyone to take his warning seriously. All they had to do, after all, was put locks on the door to the cockpit. It cost, I think, $195 to do that. The Israelis had done it 10 years before. Why they didn't take this stuff seriously is another question. So the question they asked Bogdan Zakovich, would you have gone to WikiLeaks to get that word out? And he said, I certainly would. It was just so unexplainably difficult to get that word taken seriously. And obviously, when you can 9 out of 10 times carry weapons onto aircraft, getting through security at airports, granted, this was before 9/11, but so much the more important was it. So you had all manner of people who were being suppressed, who had indications that if something indeed were planned that involved aircraft, there would have been a cakewalk to walk the cake onto the aircraft. And as you know, they only had box cutters. They could have had weapons as far as Zakovich is concerned. Now, what happened to Zakovich? Well, after he protested too much, he was given the job in the supply room to make sure that the staples were all pointing in the right direction.
Now, was he ever talked to by the 9/11 Commission?
No,
you know?
he was allowed to talk to.
They did not talk to him.
That's my impression. I'm not completely clear on that, but you can ask him. We're in touch with him.
Okay. Now, are you aware, there's two people I want people to be aware of. Are you aware of the story of David Shippers?
I'm not. I may be if you explain what that's about, but it doesn't ring any bell right off the bat.
Okay. David Shippers was the head of the legal team that prosecuted Bill Clinton for the Lewinsky thing.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to 9/11, he will claim that, quote, FBI agents in Chicago and Minnesota tell him there is going to be an attack on Lower Manhattan, end quote. Shippers will later claim that he will attempt to contact Attorney General John Ashcroft and other politicians about this warning in coming months, but that they will show little interest. He also happens to be the attorney that was representing FBI agent Robert Wright, who was in charge of an investigation called Vulgar Betrayal, which was looking into Saudi ties to terrorist financing, and he was shut down. So that's the story of David Shippers, really fast.
Mm-hmm.
Another person. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I know the Robert Wright story. That was criminal. He was on to some really big stuff about Saudi financing of Al-Qaeda. He was in Chicago at the FBI, and they just turned him right down. As for Ashcroft, I already mentioned, I think, that one of the first things he did coming into office as Attorney General, Attorney General, told the FBI, hey, terrorism? Look, let's not do terrorism. Let's do other things. Let's go after drugs. Let's go after terrorism. It's not a problem. And so the budget was actually cut from the FBI budget on counterterrorism. So it all fits in with this pattern of certainly these people either not taking the threat seriously or deliberately not taking the threat seriously because they were told precisely that. Don't worry about this threat. How could Cheney get away with this kind of thing? Look what else Cheney got away with, huh?
Right.
Sure.
Well, I think there was a story about John Ashcroft being approached, I think, by Tom Picard about terrorism, and John Ashcroft said something to the effect, "I don't want to hear about it." So,
yeah. And when a bureaucrat that wants to move up, wants to get more promoted, more promotions, then if somebody says they want to hear about it, well, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to slavishly suppress all this information and not let any of your underlings get it up to your boss, who might get upset and you might not get promoted. It's that bad. It's that bad.
Well, okay. Are you familiar with somebody by the name of Niaz Khan?
Again, John, doesn't ring a bell. Can you say a
Okay,
word?
no, that's fine. I'll read very quickly. For 3 weeks, FBI counterterrorism agents in Newark, New Jersey will interview Khan. And this is a year, I think, prior to 9/11. One FBI agent will later recall, quote, "We were incredulous. Flying a plane into a building sounded crazy, but we polygraphed him and he passed," end quote. Later in 2004, Khan will say he was only involved in a plot to hijack an airplane, not crash it into a building. However, he had earlier clearly talked to the media about flying a plane into a building, and FBI officials had also referred to his case as flying a plane into a building. A former FBI official will say that the FBI agents believe Khan and aggressively try to follow every lead in the case, but word comes from FBI headquarters saying, quote, "Return him to London and forget about it," end quote. He is returned to Britain and handed over to two British authorities. However, the British only interview him for about 2 hours and then release him. So basically what he did is he was apparently a part of Al-Qaeda and came here to the U.S. with the purpose of hijacking an aircraft, either to crash it into a building or whatever, and he chickened out and turned himself in. And told... I'm sorry, go ahead.
What year was that?
That was I think it was in 2000, April 2000, I think. I forgot to write that down, but it was definitely prior to 9/11.
Mm-hmm. Well, here we have the old problem, FBI headquarters doesn't want this thing to go forward. Now, I know enough about the lawyers, including the guy that got a big bonus for turning down Minneapolis office's request to go into Moussawi's laptop and his other effects. Spike, his last name will occur to me in a second. Now, he's one of these Marines that was a lawyer, and he became a big FBI lawyer, and he refused to send forward this request under FISA to get into Moussawi's stuff. Now, if the head of the FBI at the time, Bob Mueller, who was kind of a toady himself, is told by Ashcroft, "Look, the president isn't interested in this guy. We are not going to tell your agents to knock it off, okay?" Now, it's that bad. These guys rose to the top by acting in this manner. They expected of their subordinates, and it's entirely conceivable to me that this good work done by field agents of the FBI was all in vain simply because the guys at the top didn't want to hear it, okay? So whether that's because they were stupid, and there's ample evidence of that, Ashcroft being a paragon example, or whether this is something more sinister, which is equally possible in my view. The evidence needs to come out about what was going on at the very top. And we know enough instances where Minneapolis was screwed up, Phoenix was screwed up, the people training to fly aircraft there, lots of stuff going on in Florida that was screwed up. So, you wonder whether it was misfeasance or malfeasance. Could be a combination of both.
One of the things the family members really wanted from the 9/11 Commission was accountability, that if people were incompetent or criminally negligent or just acted criminally, that they'd be held accountable. And we didn't see that after 9/11. Instead, people that should have been held accountable, like you said, were rewarded and promoted. I forget what I was going to say, but the accountability, I know what I was going to say. The great thing about calling for accountability is that it applies to both incompetence and criminality. And generally, you find out which is which when you hold people accountable. And, we didn't see that.
They went after the people at the bottom, right? And then people at the bottom said, "Oh, wait a second, we're not going to take the rap for this thing. We were ordered to do it." So, but none of that happened, and none of that happened for lots of reasons, whether it's covering up gross incompetence or something really a lot worse. What can be worse than gross incompetence? But there can be. That's what we really need to get to the bottom of.
Yep. Yes, we do. And the last question I have for you kind of already answered. So I'm just going to use this time now to say that Cindy Sheehan and her sister Dee Dee Miller tell me to say hello to you.
Okay.
My friend Deborah wanted me to say hello to you. A lot of people admire you, Ray, and the work that you do. I am one of those people. I hope that you continue doing what you do because we very much need you. And I hope you're around for another 50 years.
Well, I'm not counting on that, but a few more perhaps. And thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about these things.
Is there anything that you would like to promote at this time?
Well, yeah. I get really upset by the confusion attending the people who are trying to find out what really happened on 9/11. They're all too easily dismissed in our mainstream media and propaganda as, quote, conspiracy theorists, end quote, when all they're trying to do is find out what the hell Hamilton and Kane didn't find out because of their incompetence, because they were told, because they're toadies, because whatever reason. Now, I have the highest regard. I have the highest respect for people who do it anyway, despite all the criticism, who bear the label conspiracy theorists, because they're just trying to find out what the truth is. And God knows that's what we Americans are supposed to be all about. At the same time, it's really difficult for someone who can't spend full time on this, like myself. People say to me, "Now, Ray, come on, Ray, don't you believe that the Chinese are capable of doing this kind of thing?" And I say, "Sure I do." well, so what's the problem? I said, well, it doesn't matter really what I believe. I don't do faith-based intelligence. I do empirical intelligence. There are lots of dots out there, but whether it was deliberate or whether it was incompetence, I just don't know. And I try to keep up with all the good work you guys are doing, and I still don't know. And that's precisely why, not just for me, of course, but for the whole world, we got to get to the bottom of this. And hats off to you, John, and to your associates for following.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. I have a quote that I'd like to read. For people to dismiss these questioners as conspiratorial advocates or conspiratorial theorists, that's completely out of line, because the questions remain, because the president who should be able to answer them will not. Do you know who said that?
No.
That was you.
Well, it's absolutely right then.
Well, again, thank you very much for your time today, Ray, and good luck with all your future endeavors.
Okay. Thanks, John. Bye.
All right. Take care.